Between September 1944 and April 1945, one of the most prolonged and bitter battles of the Second World War was fought between the Western Allies and Nazi Germany. In the battle for the Rhine, Hitler's Wehrmacht mounted a last-ditch defense of the German frontier, intended to cause the Allies major casualties, breaking their resolve and destroying the alliance between Britain and the United States. The battle for the Rhine saw some of the most audacious and dramatic gambles of the whole war. At Arnhem and the Bulge, each side tried to seize the initiative by surprise attack. At the same time, Hitler unleashed a new generation of long-range weapons designed to terrorize Germany's enemies into coming to terms. For the Allies, the push to the Rhine was to be the final assault that would bring a quick and victorious end to the European war. In fact, far from collapsing, the Wehrmacht would fight for every single mile of territory, denying the Allies victory for another 7 long months. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Western Allies launched the long-awaited invasion of German-occupied France. By the end of the first day's fighting, 150,000 troops were ashore on 5 separate beachheads. The immediate objective was to link up and consolidate before breaking out into the rest of Normandy. On the eastern flank, the British and Canadian divisions made good ground, but were halted at the town of Caen by fierce counterattacks from the German 21st and 12th SS Panzer divisions. A fierce struggle for the bomb-ruined town would rage for more than a month. To the west, American forces raced along the French coast towards the port of Cherbourg. All supplies for the 5 divisions in France still came through the landing beaches, and it was essential to capture a sizable port. The United States First Army reached Cherbourg on the 20th of June and began fighting its way through the tenacious German defense. The street combat was bitter, but after 4 days of relentless American attacks, the last of the Germans finally surrendered. By July the 28th, 1944, after nearly a month of fierce fighting in Normandy, the Allied forces in northwest France had secured an area from Coutances to Caen, the town around which the entire Normandy offensive was to pivot. When the Americans seized Avranches, elements of the newly formed 12th Army Group were able to break out and fan rapidly south. But suddenly it became clear they had bypassed the main German forces, and they were ordered to drive east, pushing all out for the River Seine. South of Caen, British and Canadian forces, struggling against fierce German resistance, were now heading for Falaise. When the town eventually fell, the German 7th Army, aware it was being squeezed in an ever-decreasing pocket by 2 massive Allied army groups, began a desperate retreat. In some of the harshest fighting of the invasion so far, the Allies struggled to close the gap through which the Germans were withdrawing. Finally, on the 20th of August, the pocket snapped shut, and 60,000 Wehrmacht troops were killed or captured. The Allied army groups joined up, and the new broad front advanced eastwards. The city of Paris, the French capital, was believed by the Allied commanders to be defended by a powerful German garrison. The Allies had therefore decided to bypass the city altogether and to continue the main drive east. However, in August 1944, members of the underground French resistance heard that the Allies were rapidly approaching and began to revolt, hoping to overthrow their Nazi oppressors before the Allies arrived. Free French units in the American First Army heard of the Paris uprising and refused to bypass the city. Defying their superiors, they struck out for the capital. The 4th Free French Armored Division fought through the Paris perimeter defenses, and the first tanks entered the city center on the 24th of August. Both the French and the American divisions following behind were greeted by ecstatic crowds, and within a day, the remnants of the German garrison had surrendered. While the Allies had been liberating northern France, a second amphibious invasion had begun assembling in Italian and African ports. The 1st Free French Army and the United States 7th Army planned to invade the south of France and meet up with the main Allied thrust in Normandy. Operation Dragoon began on August the 15th, and by the end of the first day, 94,000 men and 11,000 vehicles had landed on the Côte d'Azur. The main French and American landings for Operation Dragoon took place along the French south coast between Cannes and Cavalère. The region was lightly defended by the Germans, and the advance was rapid. The great ports of Toulon and Marseille soon fell. The US 7th Army made an attempt to outflank and trap the fleeing German 19th Army at Montélimar, but the Germans escaped. The 7th made a second attempt at Grenoble, but again, the German withdrawal was too rapid. Although the two outflanking attempts had failed, they did force the Germans into an even faster retreat. On September the 12th, 1944, just outside Dijon, the 6th Army Group met up with the right flank of the 12th Army Group, fanning south. The Allies now had a solid front line right through France, opposite the German border. Since the liberation of Paris, the Allied spearheads had continued the main advance towards Germany. In early September, the British Second Army drove across the French frontier into Belgium, and one day later liberated its capital, Brussels. Now, the British were just 100 miles from the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, and the Americans were just 70 miles from the River Rhine. Although the Allied advance since D-Day had been spectacular, it had caused serious supply problems. Every ton of fuel and ammunition had to travel hundreds of miles from the original landing sites, and Cherbourg, the only port as yet operational, was right back in Normandy. Even worse, despite the rapid retreat of the Germans, resistance was clearly growing. As the battle raged closer and closer to the Reich's frontier, the defenders would become ever more determined. Franklin Roosevelt had been President of the United States since 1932. He was one of the most popular presidents in American history, and in late 1944 faced an unprecedented fourth election. But to his friends and colleagues, it was clear that the 62-year-old Roosevelt had aged severely under the strain of office. He was in fact dying, and it took all his strength to concentrate on winning the war quickly and with as few more casualties as possible. With little thought beyond victory, Roosevelt was frustrated by the endless political machinations of both Stalin and Churchill. Nevertheless, one major post-war issue had to be decided. Where would the approaching Russian and Western armies stop? And when hostilities ceased, who would occupy which parts of Germany? At the summits of 1944 and 1945, it would be decided that Berlin, the capital of the Reich, was to be taken by the Russians. The goal of the Western Allies would be to capture Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr, lying behind the River Rhine. Tired and ill, Roosevelt would play only a minor role in the Allied negotiations, and many American leaders believed that the British and Russians were already taking advantage of his exhaustion. Roosevelt was under added pressure from his military commanders, who believed that the British held more power in the Allied command structure than the size of their armed forces justified. A rift was growing between the British and Americans that now seriously threatened the very existence of the Western Alliance. In the midst of increasing acrimony, Roosevelt tried his utmost to bolster the alliance by careful diplomacy. The president remained convinced that the preservation of the special relationship between Britain and America was the only way to ensure the fastest possible defeat of the Third Reich. Winston Churchill had been Prime Minister of Britain since May 1940 and had led the country when all her allies in Europe had been defeated by the Germans. He had gone on to lead Britain through a massive German bombing campaign and a threatened invasion. Churchill had steadfastly refused to surrender or negotiate with Germany and had launched aggressive campaigns in North Africa and the Balkans before the American entry into the war in 1941. Once the United States had declared war on Germany and had lent its vast industrial and military resources to the defeat of Hitler, Britain's influence on the conduct of the war was inevitably threatened. For more than 2 years, Churchill and his military commanders fought a highly successful campaign to preserve British influence in Allied councils. However, by 1944, there were simply too many differences. One of the most significant was over the alliance with Communist Russia. Winston Churchill was, and always had been, deeply suspicious of Stalin's Soviet Union. Already, the advancing Red Army had liberated countries not formally under communist control, and Churchill believed that Stalin had sinister plans for these nations after the war. He was deeply frustrated by the lack of American support in attempting to limit Soviet ambitions, but Roosevelt would not be swayed by any considerations that could affect how soon the war was won. Churchill understood that there were strong anti-British pressures on Roosevelt, and although determined to limit Russian post-war influence in Europe, he could not press his case too hard with the Americans. There was another equally important constraint on Churchill. Great Britain faced bankruptcy and desperately needed to end the war. As a result, Churchill was reluctantly forced to acknowledge that post-war interests would have to be set aside, and that it would be the Americans who determined how the Allies would fight the last battle in Western Europe. Despite the military setbacks of 1944 on both the Eastern and Western fronts, Adolf Hitler still hoped that he could snatch a last-minute victory. The doubts of military commanders were furiously dismissed as defeatist and traitorous, and Hitler increasingly chose loyalty and fanaticism over military competence. Hitler believed that the alliance formed against Germany was fundamentally an unnatural one, and was sure that the pact between communist Russia and the capitalist West could not possibly last. Hitler also knew of the growing tensions between Britain and America, and did everything in his power to drive a wedge between the Allies. The Führer believed that to destroy the Western alliance, the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe had to inflict such terrible casualties on the Americans in particular that they would become too demoralized to fight on. The British would be unable to win victory alone and would be forced to come to terms. With the war in the West over, Hitler could then transfer all his forces to the Eastern Front and defeat the Red Army. To this end, Hitler ordered his Wehrmacht to hold firm at all costs. They were never to give ground, and they were never to surrender. The Allied strategy for the final invasion of Germany had been drawn up before the Normandy landings had begun. Senior army commanders, hoping to win the war with as few more casualties as possible, believed that Berlin had no military benefits which could justify an extra 200-mile advance. In any case, the Allied hope was that the occupation or complete destruction of the industrial Ruhr would by itself prevent the Germans from fighting on, and so end the war before the year was out. On the way to the Ruhr, the Allies would be faced by a series of rivers and canals, formidable natural obstacles. By far the greatest was the River Rhine, symbolic frontier of the German homeland. Many Allied commanders hoped that the mere act of crossing the Reich's last barrier would result in a complete breakdown in German morale. Resistance, they believed, would crumble away, and a quick victory would be achieved. Allied spearheads had already proved themselves capable of advancing more than 75 miles a day, and by early September 1944, the Rhine lay just 70 miles from the front. The Allied advance through France had been much more rapid than the planners had anticipated, and as the supply lines were now stretched to the very limit, several generals had drawn up alternative strategies for the invasion of Germany. These new plans would not only better utilize the overstretched Allied resources, but keep the initiative against the retreating German armies, preventing them drawing breath and mounting a coordinated defense. The original Allied plan for breaking into Germany would utilize three massive army groups with American, British, Free French and Canadian armies drawn up along a continuous line opposite the German border. The armies would first have to secure the great port of Antwerp and be completely resupplied from Britain. When fully up to strength, the Allies would advance on a broad front behind two main thrusts towards the River Rhine. Once the west of the Rhine had been cleared completely of all German resistance, the Allies would mount a crossing at numerous points along the river. Once the Rhine was finally breached, the defenseless Ruhr industry could be encircled, quickly occupied, and the war brought to a rapid conclusion. The new proposals, instead of a broad front advance, called for just one narrow thrust into the heart of the Reich. The British wanted to attack through the north of Germany, while the Americans proposed their assault should penetrate further south and strike for the Nazi heartland. Both the British and American generals believed that if their strategy was the one implemented, then the war could be over by the end of October 1944. The Allied Supreme Commander, examining the alternative strategies for the invasion of Germany, could clearly see the benefits of each. The broad advance would need many weeks for the exhausted armies to recover and resupply, but it did have the advantage of producing a certain outcome. The alternative narrow thrust, although it would have a much less predictable result, could be mounted immediately. An immediate narrow thrust that could soon end the war was a highly attractive proposition. But political considerations weighed against such a move. Anglo-American relations were strained enough without allowing one ally to reap all the glory. It was decided to maintain the original strategy of a broad front advance and complete the resupplying of the armies before beginning the final assault. Hitler and his senior Wehrmacht officers understood clearly that the only possible hope the Reich had for avoiding defeat was to undermine and destroy the alliance formed against them. The Germans planned to effect this with a combination of all-out counterattacks, deadly new revenge weapons, and fortified fixed defenses. To demoralize the American forces still further, German intelligence used cleverly targeted propaganda. Leaflets and radio broadcasts continually told the American GIs that while they were doing all the fighting, the British were resting in the quiet sectors, saving their own lives at American expense. If the Allies did manage to penetrate as far as the German frontier, they would meet formidable fixed defenses. Even before the outbreak of war, the Third Reich had begun fortifying its borders. The West Wall, better known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line, was a series of fortifications stretching all along the German boundary with France. It was made up of pillboxes, anti-tank obstacles and mines. But since the Germans had banked on halting the Allies in Normandy, the West Wall had been allowed to decay. In the autumn of 1944, it was hastily improved and reinforced. And although most of the reinforcements were youths and old men, they would be extremely well armed. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, lay less than 50 miles from the Reich's border. The Ruhr's main protection was the West Wall, or Siegfried Line. 3 miles deep and running from the southern border all the way to Holland. Before the Allies could enter the Ruhr, they would have to cross several natural barriers, one of the greatest being the River Ruhr. The Ruhr was dammed in 7 places, and the largest dam, the Schwammeneuil, was 180 feet high. These dams could be opened by German engineers at any time, making the river totally impassable, or cutting off any enemy forces that had already crossed. 25 miles east of the Ruhr was the River Rhine, one of the largest and fastest flowing rivers in Europe. All the Rhine's bridges had been primed with explosives to be detonated when the Allies were just a few miles away, making an Allied forced crossing extremely hazardous. In addition to fixed defences, the Germans had improvised several tactics to prevent the Allies from crossing the rivers Ruhr and Rhine. Speedboats were packed with 100 pounds of explosives and were intended to be aimed at bridges or pontoons being constructed by the enemy. The crew would jump off at the last moment, and the boat would race on to its target. The German soldiers defending the Reich were under strict orders never to give ground. But if forced to withdraw, they were to leave nothing intact for the Allies. Every single bridge and every vehicle that could not be taken away was to be destroyed. The Germans had to make the assault on the Reich as difficult and as costly as possible. Every day that the war was prolonged was another day for the alliance to break and for the Germans to wrench victory from the jaws of defeat. General Dwight Eisenhower became the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in January 1944, promoted over 100 more senior generals. Eisenhower had a difficult dual task as supreme commander: to liaise with senior politicians and to lead an Allied army made up from a great many different nations. However, Eisenhower had extraordinary political and diplomatic abilities that would be of priceless value in leading the campaign ahead. Eisenhower was greatly admired by Roosevelt, who considered him one of the most able commanders in the United States Army, and he was on excellent terms with Prime Minister Churchill. Eisenhower had spent more than a year in England, where he had grown to love and be loved by the British people. As a result, he was very sympathetic to Britain's particular needs and problems. However, Eisenhower's close relationship with the British was occasionally prone to irritate Roosevelt, who, distancing himself more and more from Great Britain, felt that the official chain of command was being too frequently bypassed. The growing Anglo-American rift that Eisenhower had to contend with at the political level was nothing compared to the outright hostility between several military commanders. In particular, there was open rivalry between two of Eisenhower's most famous subordinates. The British Field Marshal Montgomery was a single-minded and determined commander and had led all Allied ground forces during the Battle for Normandy. As a result, he considered himself to be Eisenhower's number 2, but by early September, the American General Bradley was equal in rank. However, Bradley had few concerns other than to defeat Germany. And it was his brilliant spearhead commander, General George Patton, who became Montgomery's main challenger for glory. The contest between Patton and Montgomery to become the greatest Allied general would shake the Western alliance to the very core and test to the limit even the diplomatic talents of General Eisenhower. In 1939, Gert von Rundstedt had been brought out of retirement to command Army Group A for the invasion of Poland. Rundstedt fought a brilliant campaign, and in 1940, his forces helped conquer the French in just 6 weeks. Over the next 4 years, Rundstedt went on to fight successfully on the Eastern Front and in Italy, and never once lost a battle. In January 1944, Rundstedt was given command of the Wehrmacht in the West, with orders to deny the Allies a foothold on French territory. But by the end of June 1944, in the face of total Allied air superiority, it was clear that Rundstedt had failed. Hitler had continuously interfered and had not even allowed him to commit his reserves to battle without permission. Hitler accused von Rundstedt of being a defeatist and dismissed him at the end of the month. Rundstedt had resigned himself to the third retirement of his career when, 2 months later, he was suddenly recalled. In July 1944, a bomb had been planted by army officers in Hitler's headquarters. Von Rundstedt's successor had been implicated and committed suicide. Hitler now had a deep mistrust of all Wehrmacht commanders and knew that although Rundstedt was a defeatist, he was at least loyal. On September the 5th, 1944, Rundstedt once more became commander-in-chief of all Wehrmacht forces in the West. Field Marshal von Rundstedt was now 69 years old, and he had been in the army for 52 years. Many Wehrmacht officers believed he was tired and worn out, bringing nothing but despondency to the vital task of defending the Reich's frontier. Rundstedt knew he faced an extremely dangerous situation and was sure he would be defeated in the end. Nevertheless, he immediately began regrouping his forces and reinforcing the weakest sectors of the Western Front. The Allied advance from June to September 1944 had been achieved more rapidly than the planners had anticipated. And now, the greatest single threat to continued Allied success was from overextended supply lines. Each infantry division required 20,000 tons daily, all of which still came from Normandy. Every effort was being made to ensure the Allied spearheads were given the fuel and ammunition they needed. The most important was Operation Pluto, the laying of a series of pipelines under the sea, which directly connected Britain and France. The coils, weighing more than a destroyer, could reel out 70 miles of pipe. Once connected to the mainland, pipelines were laid all the way across France to the Allied front. In preparation for the D-Day landings, the United States Air Force and Britain's Royal Air Force had dropped thousands of tons of high explosives on Wehrmacht road, rail, and communication networks. Now that the ground forces were well established on French soil, the air forces could return the bombers to their original task of pulverizing German industry. Senior Air Force commanders believed that their efforts to destroy the Ruhr industry might yet produce the total collapse of Germany without the need for an actual invasion. As the liberation of France had progressed, the number of targets for the air forces had steadily diminished. This meant that ever greater numbers of aircraft could be concentrated against an ever-decreasing number of targets. The P-38 Lightning was designed in 1936 as a high-altitude interceptor. Built by Lockheed, it was the company's very first military design. The distinctive twin-boomed Lightning first flew in 1939, when its top speed of 400 miles per hour was exceptional. The Lightning, armed with 4 machine guns in the nose, first saw combat in Europe in August 1941 and became the first American fighter to destroy a German aircraft. The P-38 was incredibly versatile and operated successfully in all Allied theaters. As well as being a high-altitude interceptor, the Lightning's high speed would prove valuable in photo reconnaissance, as a long-range escort, and as a ground attack aircraft, often armed with 14 rockets. The Lightning was known to the Germans as the forked-tailed devil and became the only American fighter to remain in production throughout the entire war. The M4 medium tank, known to the British as the Sherman, was the standard Allied tank of World War II. As a result of neglect in engine development before the war, the designers had used an aviation engine, which gave the Sherman its distinctive high profile. This made the Sherman an easier target than many of its contemporaries. However, the Sherman was simple, easy to maintain, and highly adaptable, and by late 1944, over 40,000 had been produced. One of the most successful adaptations of the M4 was the M10 tank destroyer. The M10, fitted with a 3-inch gun, had an open-topped turret. The crew was left poorly protected, but this was more than offset by the resulting high speed and all-round vision. By September 1944, the Sherman was completely outclassed by German tanks, but what it lacked in armor and firepower, the Sherman would make up for in sheer weight of numbers. The Willis MB General Purpose or GP utility vehicle was known to Allied troops as the Jeep. The Jeep had a 4x4 transmission, which enabled it to negotiate rough terrain and reach up to 65 miles per hour on the open road. The Jeep was most highly prized as a forward reconnaissance vehicle for the main armored spearheads, but it was a versatile machine. It was used extensively as a field ambulance and as VIP transport. For amphibious operations in all theaters, the Jeep had been fitted with an extended vertical exhaust pipe, so it could drive from landing craft to beach without flooding the engine. This capability would be extremely valuable in crossing the multitude of rivers and canals protecting Germany's border. By the end of the war, an incredible 400,000 Jeeps would have been built. The Avro Lancaster was designed in 1940 and took its first flight in early 1941. It was powered by 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same engine fitted in the Spitfire fighter. The Lancaster was extremely fast and had excellent maneuverability. It was armed with 10 machine guns in 4 hydraulically operated turrets and had one of the biggest bomb bays of any aircraft. It entered service with the RAF in 1942, and by the end of the war, more than 7,000 would have been built. The Lancaster was easily adapted for a number of specialist roles. Modified Lancasters carried bouncing bombs used to destroy Germany's dams. Later in the battle, the Lancaster was the only bomber capable of carrying the massive 22,000-pound Grand Slam demolition bomb. As the mainstay of the RAF's strategic bombing effort, the Lancaster would drop 600,000 tons of bombs, more than 2/3 of the total tonnage dropped by the RAF in World War II. By early September 1944, there were over 2 million Allied troops in France. 4 massive armies of Americans and 3 more armies made up of mainly British, Canadians and French. Since the D-Day landings, the Allies had suffered nearly 250,000 dead, wounded and missing. For most Allied troops, the fighting in Normandy was the first action they had seen. Their training for combat in the months preceding D-Day had been rigorous and extensive. They were also extremely well equipped, mostly with American weapons, and during the liberation of France, each Allied soldier had received daily more than twice as much rations and ammunition as his German counterpart. In the last 3 months, the Allies had advanced over 300 miles, and morale was exceptionally high. There was a firm belief throughout the ranks that the war could be over by the end of the year. However, this optimism occasionally drifted into complacency. To many Allied soldiers, the Germans seemed clearly beaten, and many saw no reason to die when the war was so nearly won. During the battle for the Rhine, the Wehrmacht would exploit this weakness to the full. At its peak, the German army had more than 200 full-strength divisions in the field. But 5.5 years of continual conflict had steadily taken a toll on the Wehrmacht's fighting capability. By September 1944, most of the remaining 224 divisions were merely fragments of the original formations. In Western Europe, since the Allies had landed in Normandy, the Wehrmacht had lost more than 2,000 armored vehicles. Less than 100 had managed to escape from France. The German army's communication networks had also been badly hit by Allied bombing, and its supply levels had been greatly reduced. However, the remnants of the Wehrmacht were now close to, or actually in, Germany. This meant they were not just nearer to headquarters, which allowed improved coordination, but also their supply lines were much shorter, enabling faster deployment of replacements and reserves. Over the last few years, German production of armor and aircraft had been severely disrupted by the Allied strategic bombing offensive. However, in the first half of 1944, the Allies had switched the bombing offensive to transport and communication targets in France in preparation for D-Day, and German industry had made a rapid recovery. It even surpassed previous output. However, after June, production dropped off rapidly as factories and raw materials fell to the Allied advance, and the Allied bombers returned to pound German industry. As weapons stock fell, the problem for the army was compounded by the Nazi leadership, which equipped raw replacement units with the best, while starving veteran divisions of weapons and ammunition. By the autumn of 1944, the Luftwaffe had surrendered control of the skies to the Allied air forces. On D-Day, it had only managed 250 sorties, compared to 14,000 by the Allies. Over the next few months, although it was equipped with advanced aircraft, it could do little but fight a delaying action. Nevertheless, the Luftwaffe fighters would continue to rip into Allied bombing formations until their airfields were captured by the advancing Allied armies, or until they were grounded by fuel shortages. The Panzer Mark V, or Panther, was designed in 1942 in response to the vastly superior performance of Soviet tanks. Throughout its first production run, the Panther was plagued by specification changes, and its weight increased by 9 tons. The extra weight had a detrimental effect on many of its original components, and the Panther would prove very unreliable, needing a great deal of maintenance. The Panther was fitted with a new, high-velocity 75mm gun, which with smaller and lighter shells still had better armor-piercing capabilities than most other tanks. The excellent gun, combined with good maneuverability and heavy armor, made the Panther far superior to any British or American tank. The Focke-Wulf 190 was designed in 1938 to be the main Luftwaffe fighter. Its greatest asset was its extremely powerful BMW radial engine. The 190 was one of the fastest piston-engined aircraft ever to fly. It was sleek and highly maneuverable, and by the end of the war, 20,000 would have been produced. When the 190 first saw combat in 1941, it quickly proved itself superior to all Allied fighters. It was smaller, faster, more maneuverable, and was also heavily armed with 2 cannons and 2 machine guns. The 190 was continually improved, and in late 1944, the final version would be one of the greatest fighters of the war. The Messerschmitt 262 was the world's first operational jet fighter. The 262 could reach a speed of 525 miles per hour, making it by far the fastest combat aircraft of the entire war. It was well armed with 4 nose cannons, extremely responsive and excellent to fly, its high cockpit giving the pilot exceptionally good views. Although 262s were cheap to build, there were severe shortages of the metals needed for the jet turbine blades. Even worse, the engines themselves were dangerously unreliable and had a lifespan of just 25 hours. Although 1,500 262s would enter service, even that number could not affect the outcome of the war, and in any case, fuel shortages severely limited operations. However, when the 262 did see action, it was the deadliest aircraft over the battlefield. The V-2 rocket was designed as long-range artillery and was one of the greatest single advances ever made in weapons technology. The rocket began development in 1936 at Peenemünde in North Germany, and extensive testing took place throughout the 1930s. At launch, the V-2 weighed 13.5 tons, and it was driven by a powerful alcohol and liquid oxygen motor. The rocket was guided by a gyroscopic system that placed it on a ballistic trajectory. It carried enough fuel for 1 minute of thrust, at which point the engine cut out and the rocket plunged silently towards the Earth. The V-2 had a 350-mile range, and its 1-ton explosive head would strike its target at an unprecedented 3,800 miles per hour. By the end of the war, nearly 6,000 V-2 rockets would have been produced. They could be launched from mobile sites or from fixed batteries, and more than 2,500 would fall on British and continental cities. During the Rhine battles, the V-2 would be used tactically to try and stop the Allies crossing the vital rivers, protecting the Reich. For Hitler and his senior commanders, the V-2 was the ideal revenge weapon. It was meant to terrorize civilians and undermine morale, and a version was even planned that could strike the United States. A huge amount of Germany's industrial resources was poured into the rocket program in the hope that it would be the V-2 that would eventually split the Western Alliance. In 3 months of fighting since D-Day in June, the German army had lost more than 600,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. Most of the remaining 250,000 in the West were hastily retreating back to Germany. Units were at just a fraction of their designated strength. Commanders begged headquarters for more men and more equipment, but Germany had precious little reserves left. Many staff officers in the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe were sent to the front, their places taken by women, while old men, boys, industrial workers, East European volunteers, and even walking wounded were rounded up and put into uniform. Although most of the remaining German troops were poorly trained and inexperienced, there was in the retreating forces a nucleus of Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS who were hardened veterans. Their surviving commanders were some of the most experienced and tactically skilled in the world, and were able, even when in full retreat, to regroup and launch rapid counterattacks. It would be this hard core of Wehrmacht and SS who would prove deadly in finding Allied weak spots and launching the most unexpected and vicious counteroffensives. After liberating Brussels on the 3rd of September 1944, the British Army raced immediately for Antwerp, the second largest port in Europe. The capture of Antwerp was essential if the Allies were to build up the gigantic amount of supplies needed to launch the invasion of Germany. Although the British 11th Armoured Division liberated Antwerp on the 4th of September, the Germans held several islands in the estuary near to the city. Until these German strongholds were destroyed, the Allies would be unable to use the river and the port would remain closed. In the second week of September, with Antwerp unlikely to be operational in the immediate future, the British proposed an imaginative plan to cross the Rhine without delay. To head off American protests, it was a modified version of their original plan, a compromise, which would not use up all the available supplies. Codenamed Market Garden, it would be mounted without the need for a massive and time-consuming build-up of supplies. Not only this, Market Garden would also outflank Germany's Siegfried Line. On September the 10th, Eisenhower gave Market Garden the green light. Montgomery had just 7 days to finalize plans for the largest airborne offensive in history. Operation Market Garden, the British plan to seize a bridge on the River Rhine, was scheduled for the 17th of September 1944. However, with less than a week to go, there were already major problems. British planners had underestimated the sheer quantity of supplies the operation would need. They were forced to recommend to the Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower, that the offensive be postponed for a week. Eisenhower knew that German resistance was stiffening daily, and any delay would mean a stronger German defense and heavier Allied casualties. To the fury of his American generals, he ordered resources shifted from the south to support Market Garden. Allied commanders believed that the area of the planned attack was lightly defended. A persistent mist over the landing zones had hampered reconnaissance, and although there were reports that the remnants of several panzer divisions were in the region, these reports were dismissed. By the 17th of September, as planned, 3 airborne divisions were ready to drop deep behind enemy lines. To pave the way for Operation Market Garden, on September the 16th, Allied bombers launched heavy attacks in and around the target area. German army barracks and local air defenses were hit repeatedly. The following morning, the airborne landings began. Because of a shortage of transport aircraft, the landing forces had to be dropped in waves, even though it weakened the impact of the assault. As the first wave of nearly 20,000 paratroops and glidermen dropped into 3 main landing zones, only a few aircraft were shot down. However, many gliders broke their tow ropes and were lost. Of the 3 attacking formations, it was the British 1st Airborne Division that was charged with securing the operation's main objective, the bridge over the River Rhine at Arnhem. Because of the fear of heavy flak around the town, 1st Airborne had dropped 8 miles away. There was already the risk of losing the element of surprise. But to make matters worse, by a stroke of bad luck, the lost gliders contained nearly all the force's armored jeeps. Even at this stage, the division was having trouble with its radios. But there was worse to come. Almost immediately, the force ran into the 9th SS Panzer Division and found itself involved in heavy fighting. While the British 1st Airborne Division had landed west of the Rhine Bridge at Arnhem, the American 82nd Airborne had landed near Nijmegen, intending to seize bridges over the River Waal and on the Meuse. Meanwhile, the US 101st Airborne had landed just north of Eindhoven, aiming to secure bridges over nearby canals. At the same time as the airborne attacks, a ground assault, spearheaded by the British 30th Corps, had struck northeast and was aiming to meet up with the airborne formations dropped behind enemy lines. The initial wave of 1st Airborne Division, dropped outside Arnhem, had been blocked by 9th SS Panzer Division at the village of Oosterbeek. Only 500 paratroops of the 2nd Parachute Battalion succeeded in getting into Arnhem. The battalion seized the northern end of the Rhine Bridge, but elements of the 10th SS Panzer Division prevented a crossing, and the battalion was isolated. A second wave of paratroops was dropped at Oosterbeek and attempted to break into Arnhem, but was blocked by the Germans. The Allies tried to airdrop supplies to 1st Airborne, but the target was missed, and the supplies fell into German hands. The 1st Polish Parachute Brigade landed south of the Rhine, meaning to link up with the British, but the Poles were foiled by a strong German defense. There was still no sign of the Allied ground forces supposed to link up with 1st Airborne. On the 21st of September, the British force holding the northern end of the bridge at Arnhem surrendered. It had lost half its men. 4 days later, 2,000 survivors of the 1st Airborne Division's battle at Oosterbeek withdrew back across the Rhine, leaving Arnhem to the Germans. Although Operation Market Garden had failed in its main objective to capture a bridge over the Rhine, there had been some success elsewhere. 30th Corps had relieved the American 101st Airborne at Wegel, and the next day had pushed on to meet 82nd Airborne south of Nijmegen. After hard fighting, and in spite of fierce German counterattacks, the 82nd had succeeded in capturing the Waal Bridge. For General Eisenhower, in spite of the success of some of the airborne forces, the failure of Market Garden to deliver the promised Rhine crossing proved the folly of a narrow front attack. As for Montgomery, his reputation had suffered a severe blow, and he would never regain his former influence with the Supreme Commander. By the early autumn of 1944, the industrial might of the United States had given the Allies overwhelming superiority over their German enemies. The Western Allies could muster 14,000 planes and over 2,000 tanks on the Western Front. On the ground, 56 divisions were organized into 3 massive army groups behind a front 500 miles long. As well as their overwhelming superiority on the ground, the Allies also outnumbered the Germans by 25-1 in aircraft. Both the British Royal Air Force and the American Army Air Force had large numbers of ground attack planes, organized into tactical units. Fighter bombers such as the British Hawker Typhoon and the American P-47 Thunderbolt operated in close support of every Allied ground operation. When the weather allowed, large numbers roamed behind German lines, pouncing on anything that moved, and almost completely depriving the Germans of daytime mobility. Meanwhile, Allied motor transport and armor could mass behind the front with little fear of disruption. General Eisenhower's three army groups were the 21st, 12th, and 6th. The 21st Army Group was commanded by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery fielded the British Second Army with 6 armoured, 8 infantry, and 2 airborne divisions, and the Canadian First Army with 2 armoured, 3 infantry divisions, and 1 armoured brigade. The 12th Army Group was commanded by General Omar Bradley. Bradley had First Army with 2 armoured and 2 infantry divisions. Third Army with 1 armoured and 7 infantry divisions. And 9th Army, also with 1 armoured and 7 infantry divisions. The 6th Army Group had come up from southern France and was commanded by General Jacob L. Devers. Devers had the 7th United States Army with 1 armoured, 5 infantry, and 1 airborne division, and 1st French Army with 3 armoured divisions, 1 motorized division, 1 mountain, and 3 infantry divisions. While the Allied advance was halted by the German victory at Arnhem and by continued supply problems, the Wehrmacht in the West set feverishly about reinforcing its defences. The generally poor quality of replacement manpower was still a serious weakness, although 1 high-caliber formation was created in September. The 30,000-strong 1st Parachute Army was formed from a corps of 6 Luftwaffe parachute regiments and would acquit itself well in the coming battles. With the defending army groups down to barely more than 100 tanks, panzer reinforcements were desperately needed. Although during September, nearly 500 heavy tanks and tank destroyers were sent west in 10 new brigades, their inexperience would count against them. Meanwhile, there were plans to raise a new Panzer Army, the 6th, which would be available for offensive operations. But as yet, there were too few new tanks available. German Army Group B was deployed on the Northwest Front and was commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model. Model had the 15th and 7th Infantry Armies, the newly formed 1st Paratroop Army, and 5th Panzer Army. Army Group G held the southern sector of the front, commanded by General Hermann Balck. Army Group G had 1st and 19th Armies. Altogether, the two German army groups on the Western Front had 6 panzer divisions, along with 10 independent panzer brigades, 9 motorized infantry divisions, and 46 infantry and parachute divisions. By late September 1944, in the wake of the failure of Operation Market Garden, the Allies had been forced to realize that the war was not going to be won by the end of the year. Supplies were still a problem, and while the Allied armies were building up for the next major offensive, the generals had to decide whether to dig in and take up defensive positions for the winter, or maintain pressure on the Wehrmacht by relentless attacks. Already the weather had turned cold and wet, but Allied commanders decided to give the Germans no breathing space. A limited offensive would be launched to push the front right up to the Siegfried Line. At the same time, in order to open up the port of Antwerp, a concerted effort would be made to clear the remaining Germans from their island sanctuaries in the Scheldt estuary. It was units of the German 15th Army that continued to resist in the Scheldt estuary, and along with dense German minefields, blocked Allied access to the port of Antwerp. On the 1st of October, the Canadian First Army attacked, with its main thrust towards the German stronghold on Beaverland. German resistance was determined, but by the 16th, Woensdrecht was captured, trapping the Germans on the peninsula. The Canadians cleared the northern coast of the mainland, but it took 2 more weeks to reach Goes and secure the peninsula. The Germans were forced to flee to Walcheren. On the 1st of November, the British Royal Air Force bombed Walcheren's dikes, flooding much of the island. The 1st Canadian Army then launched a powerful amphibious attack. It took a week of fierce fighting before Walcheren was in Allied hands. Only then could the task of sweeping the estuary for mines begin. By now, the Allied front was advancing towards the Siegfried Line. The line was defended by the German 7th Army in the north and the 1st and 5th Panzer and 19th Armies in the south. The British 2nd Army attacked north and southeast through the Peel marshes, while the US 3rd Army began pushing through the heavily defended Saar region, with its right flank laying siege to Metz. As the 7th Army struck towards Strasbourg and the French attacked through Belfort, the US 1st and 9th Armies, pushing towards Aachen, entered the Hurtgen Forest, an area of more than 30 square miles. The intention was to capture the city and push on towards the Siegfried Line. The drive through the Hurtgen Forest in early October 1944 was supposed to be part of a limited offensive. What no one had expected was that it would turn into a major battle, and one of the bloodiest yet fought by American troops. Once inside the Hurtgen Forest, the Americans quickly found that the German 1st Parachute Army had strongly fortified every town and village in their path. Even worse, the West Wall ran right through the middle of the forest, and its defenses had been heavily reinforced. Nor could the Americans get help from their normally overwhelming air power. The forest was simply too dense for accurate bombing. The city of Aachen was the most strongly defended in the Hürtgen forest area, and one of the Allies' main objectives. The Germans put up a determined fight, inflicting heavy casualties on the Americans. But on the 21st of October, Aachen fell. It was the first German city to be captured by the Allies. The grim battle in the Hürtgen forest continued for another 3 weeks, until finally, in early December, 1st and 9th Armies reached the banks of the River Roer. The struggle to clear the Hürtgen forest had cost the two American armies 35,000 dead and wounded, and reduced several divisions to tatters. Further south, Patton's Third Army had also faced stiff opposition, especially around Metz. The city eventually fell on the 18th of November. Just over a week later, Third Army began its assault on the Siegfried Line. By the first week of December, despite fierce German resistance, American men and armor were pouring through the breaches. While Third Army had been smashing its way through the Siegfried Line, the First French Army had secured the Belfort region and was steadily destroying the 19th German Army. On the 23rd of November, the US 7th Army had reached Strasbourg, and the following day, the city fell to the French troops of the Army's 2nd Division. By now, the Scheldt estuary had been cleared of mines, and the first Allied merchant ships had entered the port of Antwerp. In its first week of operations, the port handled more than 10,000 tons of supplies a day, and the figure was rising fast. Allied commanders were now confident that their armies would soon be fully supplied and would be ready to launch a full-scale offensive against Germany early in the new year. In the drive to conquer the German homeland, the Allies would have to cross several major obstacles before they would even reach the River Rhine. With the Siegfried Line now breached in several places, the next great barrier was the River Roer. Engineers using models of the Roer and its surrounding countryside were already trying to predict for Allied planners what would happen if the Germans flooded the river and how the attacking forces might cope. As plans intended to deal with this and countless other contingencies were devised, the Allies were confident that all such obstacles could be overcome. What no one amongst the Allied commanders suspected was that the Germans were not going to wait passively for the great offensive to begin. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers, expecting to sit out the winter in relative peace, were to be the victims of one of the most audacious counterattacks in history. Hitler and his senior Wehrmacht commanders had been planning to launch a major counteroffensive against the Allies since mid-September. The objective of the attack was to capture Antwerp. Not only would the capture or destruction of Antwerp prevent supplies reaching the Allied armies, it would also split Allied forces in two, demoralizing the alliance and forcing its leaders to negotiate. For the attack, Hitler concentrated the best of his remaining forces in the west. 240,000 men in 28 divisions, with 1,200 tanks and assault guns. The offensive began at 05:30 on December the 16th, with a barrage by 900 German guns. 1 hour later, 3 German armies smashed into the American front line. By now, the front line in the west followed the course of the Roer, Our, and Saar rivers. In southern Belgium, the line faced the Ardennes, a hilly and in places heavily wooded region. It was through this area that Hitler intended to thrust towards the bridges over the River Meuse and the port of Antwerp. For the attack, the Germans had deployed the newly formed 6th Panzer Army, together with the 5th Panzer and 7th Army, facing the weak gap between the American 1st and 9th Armies. Although the thrust by the 6th Panzer Army made slow progress, a spearhead managed to break through the American line and dashed headlong for the Meuse. To the south, 5th Panzer Army punched right through the inexperienced 106th Division, but then its advance was slowed by the veteran 28th. Eventually, 5th Panzer Army did break through, reaching Saint-Vite and the vital road junction of Bastogne. However, the Germans failed to take the town, which was soon reinforced by the American 101st Airborne Division. Although some German units then bypassed Bastogne and charged for the Meuse, the main advance was blocked. To Allied commanders, the German offensive through the Ardennes had come as a stunning blow. No one had believed that the Germans were capable of mounting a large-scale attack. Nor had anyone imagined that Hitler would be so foolish as to risk his last remaining forces in one great gamble. The shock was deepened by the German use of special units, dressed and equipped as Americans, to sow confusion and mistrust in the American ranks. The Germans' success in the attack so far had been, in part, due to the weather. Many of the attacking troops were veterans of the Eastern Front and accustomed to the harsh wintry conditions. Dense cloud cover had also denied the Americans use of their reconnaissance and ground attack aircraft. However, in spite of these advantages, the attack was already behind schedule. The Americans had refused to surrender at Bastogne, while elsewhere, blown bridges had slowed the advance, and all German units were suffering from a desperate shortage of fuel. Meanwhile, the Allies were recovering from the first shock of the onslaught. Almost at once, Eisenhower had moved to try and stabilize the situation in the Ardennes. Although it angered some American generals, he transferred command of the US 1st and 9th Armies away from Bradley and gave it to Montgomery, who was north of the Bulge and so better placed to command. Montgomery acted quickly, reinforcing the Meuse bridges with the British 30th Corps, while the 1st and 9th rallied and blocked any further German advance towards the river. While Montgomery was strengthening the Allied defense in the north, Patton's Third Army had made an extraordinarily rapid 90-degree wheel, and had ploughed into the German southern flank. On the 26th of December, the Third broke through to relieve the defenders of Bastogne. Already the weather had cleared, unleashing Allied air power, while crippled by lack of fuel, the Germans ground to a halt at Dinant. The Allies had contained the German thrust, and now they began to squeeze out the massive bulge in the line caused by the German advance. Allied forces met up at Houffalize, and by the end of January, they had pushed the Germans back to their start positions. In the struggle that became known as the Battle of the Bulge, the Allies had lost almost 90,000 men, killed, wounded, and captured, nearly all of them Americans. The Germans had lost 120,000, many of them because Hitler had refused to allow a timely withdrawal, even when the offensive had clearly failed. 600 German tanks had been destroyed, along with vast numbers of heavy weapons of all types. Months of the Reich's war production had been expended for nothing. Although at the Bulge the United States had won a sizable victory, the battle in the Ardennes had forced Eisenhower to face several uncomfortable facts. In the early stages of the fighting, American morale had fallen apart. Thousands had deserted, and the first GI for nearly 100 years had been executed for cowardice. For the Supreme Commander, it was a worrying picture, and the situation was made more difficult by the attitude of Field Marshal Montgomery. Shortly after the battle, Montgomery had hinted publicly that as he had been given temporary command of the US 1st and 9th Armies, he had saved the Americans from certain defeat. The American generals were furious, and Eisenhower threatened to resign if Montgomery did not do so first. By the start of 1945, relations between the American and British military had sunk to a new low. However, the crisis was averted when Montgomery apologized to Eisenhower. Even the willful and stubborn British Field Marshal had been forced to concede that with the Allies about to embark on the last great attack on Nazi Germany, unity was everything. The German counterattack in the Ardennes had succeeded in delaying the Allied push on the Rhine by only 6 weeks. By the end of January 1945, the supplies needed for the Great Assault were almost in place, and all 3 Allied army groups were poised to launch the offensive. Each army group had devised its own plans for reaching the River Rhine. Montgomery's 21st had a 2-pronged strategy, Operation Veritable and Operation Grenade, both timed to begin on the 8th of February. Both prongs involved attacks through a heavily wooded region called the Reichswald. However, unknown to the Allies, the German 1st Parachute Army had heavily reinforced the Reichswald right in the path of the offensive. The climate also favored the Germans. By now, the winter snow had begun to thaw. Floods and mud would seriously reduce the attackers' mobility. Operation Veritable, the 21st Army Group's northern thrust, began on schedule on the 8th of February. The greatest artillery barrage yet seen in the West numbed the first line of defenders. However, as British and Canadian troops plunged into the wooded region of the Reichswald, the 1st Parachute Army put up a bitter fight, holding out for more than a week. The Canadians and British finally captured the towns of Cleve and Goch and broke through to secure the west bank of the Rhine, from Emmerich to the German town of Wesel. The 21st Army Group's southern thrust, Operation Grenade, was to be mounted by the US 9th Army and was to attack towards Dusseldorf and Cologne. Facing the Americans were divisions of the German 15th Army. The operation was meant to begin at the same time as the northern attack, but the Germans opened the Rohr dams and flooded much of the region. It took 2 weeks for the Rohr floods to subside, and only then could the Americans advance. Once the attack got going, it made good progress. By the 2nd of March, 9th Army had secured positions on the west bank of the Rhine. 2 days later, elements of 1st Army also reached the river, and on the 5th, they entered the suburbs of Cologne. German resistance in Cologne was particularly fierce. The defenders clung to every pile of rubble, and the process of clearing the city was agonizing and costly. It was 2 days before Cologne finally surrendered. To the south, 12th Army Group, with the American 1st Army and elements of 3rd Army, had begun its two-pronged drive to the Rhine. Facing the Americans were the German 5th Panzer Army and the 15th and 7th Armies. Operation Lumberjack made good progress, heading through the Eifel region towards Koblenz. As the Allies advanced closer to the Rhine, they meant only to secure the west bank. However, on the 7th of March, elements on the extreme right flank of the US 1st Army approached the Rhine close to the town of Remagen, only to discover that a bridge had been left intact. As the 9th Armoured Division had driven through Remagen, they had expected to find the railway bridge over the Rhine had been blown by the Germans. However, the Germans' main explosive charges had failed to detonate, and the reserve charges had weakened the bridge, but had failed to destroy it. At once, the astonished Americans raced to seize the crossing. The American commanders, Bradley and Eisenhower, had seen the possibility of capturing a bridge over the Rhine intact as extremely remote. No plans had been made for such an unlikely event. All that Bradley could do was to rush the nearest units to the bridge and get them across as fast as was humanly possible. Almost at once, engineers began to construct another 2 treadway bridges upstream. By the evening of the first day, the bridgehead on the east bank of the Rhine was packed with American men and equipment. Nor was First Army content merely to consolidate the bridgehead. Almost at once, a force struck out to sever the main German autobahn between Frankfurt and Cologne. While 21st Army Group was closing to the Rhine opposite Wesel, and in the center, the Remagen bridgehead was being secured, 12th and 6th Army Groups had also been making progress. Third Army was pushing closer to Koblenz, and 7th, together with the right flank of Third Army, had begun Operation Undertone, clearing an area up to the Rhine between Koblenz and Strasbourg. The French First Army had finally liquidated the last pocket of German resistance around Colmar, and by the end of March 1945, the Allies held a line running the whole length of the River Rhine. For the Germans, the loss of the bridge at Remagen had been a stunning blow. The enemy had crossed Germany's greatest river frontier almost without a fight. As news of the latest disaster had reached Hitler, he had flown into an uncontrollable rage. The commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht in the West, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, was fired, and the officers who had failed to blow the bridge were shot. Hitler was determined to destroy the bridge at Remagen, and for the first and only time, the V-2 rocket was used as a tactical weapon. The attacks failed. In any case, nothing could now prevent a massive Allied offensive along the whole length of the River Rhine and into the German heartland. Even before the 3 Allied army groups had closed up to the Rhine, the staffs of each had begun to plan for the final crossing. Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group planned a powerful amphibious assault, codenamed Operation Plunder. For the attack, naval landing craft had been transported overland to the front, and 250,000 tons of supplies had been stockpiled. With 3 full-strength armies and 5,000 artillery pieces, Montgomery intended to seize a substantial bridgehead over the Rhine, and then, maintaining the momentum, strike deep into Germany. Operation Plunder would be reinforced by Operation Varsity, a powerful assault by the US 17th Airborne and British 6th Airborne divisions with 3,000 aircraft and gliders. These forces would be dropped east of the Rhine to enlarge the bridgehead. Operations Plunder and Varsity were scheduled to begin on March the 24th. While the 21st Army Group was making final preparations for its enormous set-piece attack across the Rhine, Bradley's 12th Army Group, including Patton's 3rd Army, was finalizing its own plans. Patton's men had reached the Rhine later than Montgomery, and there had been no time to build up anything like the same vast quantities of fuel and ammunition. Patton was keen to press on regardless. He was determined to outdo First Army's achievement at Remagen, and above all, to beat Montgomery to a Rhine crossing. In the middle of the night of the 22nd of March, less than 2 weeks after Patton's men had reached the Rhine, 5th Division succeeded in winning a bridgehead. Patton had beaten Montgomery by 2 full days. On the night of the 23rd of March, a huge Lancaster attack hammered the German town of Wesel, directly across the Rhine from where Montgomery's 21st Army Group was poised to launch Operation Plunder. After a short but intense artillery barrage, the Allied amphibious crossings began. Protected by a massive smoke screen, the crossings continued through the night and into the next day. German resistance was sporadic. At 9 a.m. on the morning of the 24th of March, the parachute landings began just north of Wesel. Even though German anti-aircraft batteries inflicted heavy casualties on the paratroops and gliders, the landing forces made good progress. Soon they had linked up with the ground formations to attack Wesel itself. The German 1st Parachute Army resisted fiercely, but by the 25th of March, the last of the defenders had fled or been captured. Within 3 days, the Wesel bridgehead was 25 miles deep and 25 miles wide. With 21st Army Group's capture of its bridgehead at Wesel, Montgomery's men were now on the threshold of the Ruhr, well placed to seize Germany's industrial center. 12th Army Group's 1st Army continued to cross at Remagen, while Patton's 3rd Army, already across at Oppenheim, won 2 more bridgeheads further north. Meanwhile, 7th Army crossed near Worms, and the French 1st Army crossed at Germersheim. By the end of March, the east bank of the River Rhine was a chain of Allied bridgeheads. On March the 28th, General Eisenhower announced that the Western Allies would not be capturing Berlin. Although at the Yalta Conference the Allied leaders had agreed that after the war Berlin would fall in the Soviet occupation zone, the British, and especially Winston Churchill, still believed that a drive on the German capital should be mounted. It would at least serve to ensure that when the Germans surrendered, more territory would be in Western hands. However, Eisenhower refused to back any such idea. To him, it seemed pointless to expend lives on capturing ground that would, in any case, have to be handed over to the Soviets when the war was over. It was not only Churchill who was dismayed by the American refusal to push east. Montgomery, too, was infuriated, although for quite different reasons. The German capital lay in Montgomery's path, and he had looked forward to capturing the greatest prize of the European war. To make matters worse, his role in encircling the Ruhr had also been downgraded on Eisenhower's orders. Bradley's 12th Army Group would complete the Ruhr encirclement, while Montgomery's forces would only play a supporting role. For weeks, German Army Group B had been heavily reinforcing the Ruhr region. Although most of its industries continued to function, The Ruhr was by now almost cut off from the rest of Germany by the Allies' carefully targeted bombing of rail centres, bridges and viaducts. Nevertheless, the Ruhr was still seen by Hitler as absolutely vital to the defence of the Reich, and the whole area was being turned into a fortress. The commander of Army Group B, Field Marshal Model, had set up his headquarters inside the Ruhr. Model had 15th Army and 5th Panzer Army, along with elements of other formations numbering more than 200,000 men. Orders were to hold out to the very end. The Allied strategy for dealing with the massive concentration of German forces in the Ruhr was to encircle the area with two deep thrusts. Starting on March the 28th, 7 armies broke out of their Rhine bridgeheads and smashed into the German defense. The Allied plan was that in the north, the British Second Army was to drive in the direction of Hamburg and down the River Elbe. The Canadians, starting a few days later, would clear Holland and the North German coast. Meanwhile, Patton's Third would drive into central Germany, and to the south, the US 7th Army and the French First Army would push down to the line of the Danube. In the center, while most of the US 1st and 9th Armies encircled the Ruhr, some units would push on to the Elbe. No Allied forces were to cross the river. East of the Elbe was to be left to the Russians. As the offensive opened and the Second British Army drove northeast, on its right, the US 9th Army smashed into German Army Group B and swung around the Ruhr. At the same time, Third Army took Frankfurt against fierce German resistance and met up with First Army at Gießen. The German 89th Corps was encircled, and a wedge had been driven between Army Groups B and G. First Army went on to complete the encirclement of the Ruhr from the south by meeting 9th Army at Lippstadt on April the 1st. The German 15th Army, 5th Panzer Army, and most of the 1st Parachute Army were now trapped in the Ruhr. In the Ruhr pocket, an area 30 miles by 70 miles, was the last great concentration of German forces in the West. The encircled units made one attempt after another to break the ring, but their efforts were weak and uncoordinated. The Germans were also trying to form a new army to the east, 11th Army, which could break through to the Ruhr and relieve the pocket. But they failed to assemble more than a handful of already weak divisions. However, the sudden appearance of SS battle groups from inside the pocket, mounting fierce counterattacks, caused anxious moments for Allied commanders. Rather than simply contain the Ruhr pocket with the minimum of forces, General Bradley now decided to defeat the trapped German armies in the Ruhr. The result was nearly 3 weeks of difficult and frustrating action. Although some cities and towns surrendered at once, others saw fanatical last stands in the rubble of bombed-out factories and streets. Although it took 18 American divisions nearly 3 weeks to end all resistance, the outcome of the Ruhr battle was never in doubt. All the same, the scale of the victory astonished Allied commanders. When German resistance finally petered out on April the 18th, 317,000 German prisoners were taken, including 25 generals and an admiral. More prisoners than in the mass surrenders at Stalingrad or Tunisia. Pockets of resistance, some of them strong and determined, would be met by Allied forces until the very end. But nothing could now prevent the Allies from sweeping through the German interior. As the Allied advance raced through Germany, it rapidly approached the Russians, who were themselves now closing in on the River Elbe. There was a real chance of accidental clashes between forward units. To reduce the risk, the Americans and Russians exchanged liaison officers and special recognition signals were devised. Finally, on the 25th of April 1945, Red Army and Western forces met near Torgau on the Elbe, as units of the 5th Soviet Guards Army and the 69th Division of the 1st American Army made contact. Germany had been cut in half. While the Western Allies were eliminating the final pockets of German resistance on their side of the River Elbe, the Russians began the assault on Berlin. Inside the city, Hitler and a handful of followers sheltered in a bunker deep beneath the Reichschancellery, while Berlin was turned to rubble over their heads, and surviving German units resisted fanatically to the end. By the time the city surrendered on May the 2nd, 300,000 Russians and an unknown number of Germans were dead in the ruins. Two days before the fall of Berlin, Adolf Hitler had committed suicide in his bunker. However, although the Führer was gone, German resistance continued. Knowing of the grim fate that awaited them at the hands of the Russians, many German units were determined to fight their way west and surrender to American or British forces. To buy time for units in the east to escape, German formations in the west kept fighting for long after they would otherwise have given up. On May the 4th, German forces in Northern Europe surrendered unconditionally to Field Marshal Montgomery, and 3 days later, the remaining German forces in the West surrendered to Eisenhower's staff. On that day, Eisenhower announced that the mission of the Allied forces was complete. Nazi Germany had been utterly destroyed, and after nearly 6 long and bitter years, the war in Europe was over. Free French units in the American First Army heard of the Paris uprising and refused to bypass the city. Defying their superiors, they struck out for the capital. The 4th Free French Armored Division fought through the Paris perimeter defenses, and the first tanks entered the city center on the 24th of August. Both the French and the American divisions following behind were greeted by ecstatic crowds, and within a day, the remnants of the German garrison had surrendered. While the Allies had been liberating northern France, a second amphibious invasion had begun assembling in Italian and African ports. The First Free French Army and the United States Seventh Army planned to invade the south of France and meet up with the main Allied thrust in Normandy. Operation Dragoon began on August the 15th, and by the end of the first day, 94,000 men and 11,000 vehicles had landed on the Côte d'Azur. The main French and American landings for Operation Dragoon took place along the French south coast between Cannes and Cavalaire. The region was lightly defended by the Germans, and the advance was rapid. The great ports of Toulon and Marseille soon fell. The US Seventh Army made an attempt to outflank and trap the fleeing German 19th Army at Montélimar, but the Germans escaped. The 7th made a second attempt at Grenoble, but again, the German withdrawal was too rapid. Although the two outflanking attempts had failed, they did force the Germans into an even faster retreat. On September the 12th, 1944, just outside Dijon, the 6th Army Group met up with the right flank of the 12th Army Group, fanning south. The Allies now had a solid front line right through France, opposite the German border. Since the liberation of Paris, the Allied spearheads had continued the main advance towards Germany. In early September, the British Second Army drove across the French frontier into Belgium, and one day later, liberated its capital, Brussels. Now, the British were just 100 miles from the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, and the Americans were just 70 miles from the river and 12th SS Panzer Divisions. A fierce struggle for the bomb-ruined town would rage for more than a month. To the west, American forces raced along the French coast towards the port of Cherbourg. All supplies for the 5 divisions in France still came through the landing beaches, and it was essential to capture a sizable port. The United States First Army reached Cherbourg on the 20th of June and began fighting its way through the tenacious German defense. The street combat was bitter, but after 4 days of relentless American attacks, the last of the Germans finally surrendered. By July the 28th, 1944, after nearly a month of fierce fighting in Normandy, the Allied forces in northwest France had secured an area from Coutances to Caen, the town around which the entire Normandy offensive was to pivot. When the Americans seized Avranches, elements of the newly formed 12th Army Group were able to break out and fan rapidly south. But suddenly it became clear they had bypassed the main German forces, and they were ordered to drive east, pushing all out for the River Seine. South of Caen, British and Canadian forces, struggling against fierce German resistance, were now heading for Falaise. When the town eventually fell, the German Seventh Army, aware it was being squeezed in an ever-decreasing pocket by two massive Allied army groups, began a desperate retreat. In some of the harshest fighting of the invasion so far, the Allies struggled to close the gap through which the Germans were withdrawing. Finally, on the 20th of August, the pocket snapped shut, and 60,000 Wehrmacht troops were killed or captured. The Allied army groups joined up, and the new broad front advanced eastwards. The city of Paris, the French capital, was believed by the Allied commanders to be defended by a powerful German garrison. The Allies had therefore decided to bypass the city altogether and to continue the main drive east. However, in August 1944, members of the underground French resistance heard that the Allies were rapidly approaching and began to revolt, hoping to overthrow their Nazi oppressors before the Allies arrived. Rhine. Although the Allied advance since D-Day had been spectacular, it had caused serious supply problems. Every ton of fuel and ammunition had to travel hundreds of miles from the original landing sites, and Cherbourg, the only port as yet operational, was right back in Normandy. Even worse, despite the rapid retreat of the Germans, resistance was clearly growing. As the battle raged closer and closer to the Reich's frontier, the defenders would become ever more determined. Franklin Roosevelt had been President of the United States since 1932. He was one of the most popular presidents in American history, and in late 1944 faced an unprecedented fourth election. But to his friends and colleagues, it was clear that the 62-year-old Roosevelt had aged severely under the strain of office. He was in fact dying, and it took all his strength to concentrate on winning the war quickly and with as few more casualties as possible. With little thought beyond victory, Roosevelt was frustrated by the endless political machinations of both Stalin and Churchill. Nevertheless, one major post-war issue had to be decided. Where would the approaching Russian and Western armies stop? And when hostilities ceased, who would occupy which parts of Germany? At the summits of 1944 and 1945, it would be decided that Berlin, the capital of the Reich, was to be taken by the Russians. The goal of the Western Allies would be to capture Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr, lying behind the River Rhine. Tired and ill, Roosevelt would play only a minor role in the Allied negotiations, and many American leaders believed that the British and Russians were already taking advantage of his exhaustion. Roosevelt was under added pressure from his military commanders, who believed that the British held more power in the Allied command structure than the size of their armed forces justified. A rift was growing between the British and Americans that now seriously threatened the very existence of the Western Alliance. In the midst of increasing acrimony, Roosevelt tried his utmost to bolster the alliance by careful diplomacy. The president remained convinced that the preservation of the special relationship between Britain and America was the only way to ensure the fastest possible defeat of the Third Reich. Between September 1944 and April 1945, one of the most prolonged and bitter battles of the Second World War was fought between the Western Allies and Nazi Germany. In the battle for the Rhine, Hitler's Wehrmacht mounted a last-ditch defense of the German frontier, intended to cause the Allies major casualties, breaking their resolve and destroying the alliance between Britain and the United States. The battle for the Rhine saw some of the most audacious and dramatic gambles of the whole war. At Arnhem and the Bulge, each side tried to seize the initiative by surprise attack. At the same time, Hitler unleashed a new generation of long-range weapons designed to terrorize Germany's enemies into coming to terms. For the Allies, the push to the Rhine was to be the final assault that would bring a quick and victorious end to the European war. In fact, far from collapsing, the Wehrmacht would fight for every single mile of territory, denying the Allies victory for another 7 long months. On D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, the Western Allies launched the long-awaited invasion of German-occupied France. By the end of the first day's fighting, 150,000 troops were ashore on 5 separate beachheads. The immediate objective was to link up and consolidate before breaking out into the rest of Normandy. On the eastern flank, the British and Canadian divisions made good ground, but were halted at the town of Caen by fierce counterattacks from the German 21st. Winston Churchill had been Prime Minister of Britain since May 1940 and had led the country when all her allies in Europe had been defeated by the Germans. He had gone on to lead Britain through a massive German bombing campaign and a threatened invasion. Churchill had steadfastly refused to surrender or negotiate with Germany and had launched aggressive campaigns in North Africa and the Balkans before the American entry into the war in 1941. Once the United States had declared war on Germany and had lent its vast industrial and military resources to the defeat of Hitler, Britain's influence on the conduct of the war was inevitably threatened. For more than 2 years, Churchill and his military commanders fought a highly successful campaign to preserve British influence in Allied councils. However, by 1944, there were simply too many differences. One of the most significant was over the alliance with Communist Russia. Winston Churchill was, and always had been, deeply suspicious of Stalin's Soviet Union. Already, the advancing Red Army had liberated countries not formally under communist control, and Churchill believed that Stalin had sinister plans for these nations after the war. He was deeply frustrated by the lack of American support in attempting to limit Soviet ambitions, but Roosevelt would not be swayed by any considerations that could affect how soon the war was won. Churchill understood that there were strong anti-British pressures on Roosevelt, and although determined to limit Russian post-war influence in Europe, he could not press his case too hard with the Americans. There was another equally important constraint on Churchill. Great Britain faced bankruptcy and desperately needed to end the war. As a result, Churchill was reluctantly forced to acknowledge that post-war interests would have to be set aside, and that it would be the Americans who determined how the Allies would fight the last battle in Western Europe. Despite the military setbacks of 1944 on both the Eastern and Western fronts, Adolf Hitler still hoped that he could snatch a last-minute victory. The doubts of military commanders were furiously dismissed as defeatist and traitorous, and Hitler increasingly chose loyalty and fanaticism over